Actually, he ended up in Indianapolis and had the job. And when he hired me after Indianapolis, he said, I'm here for the job. I saw the Deborah on there. I said, that's it. You got it. And he wrote, oh, yeah. Fascinating person. Well, they all studied this, like, this function of this, you know,
So I shouldn't mute it while all this noise. Yeah, mute it now. Wait, where's your sound on here? What button is it?
Here.
Face this way. And you can fill up your plates with dessert, fruit, coffee, whatever your needs are. And feel free while this is going on to refresh yourselves with some food. Okay, I am Carol Colbert, and I'm here to welcome you to our program today. I chair the Cultural Committee, which provides Jewish educational programs to our community. So today, let me start with introducing you to Mike Brown, who is the Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society, before I introduce you to our speaker. Here's Mike.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for coming out here today. Dear fellow Hoosiers, Northwest Indiana Jewish Federation, members of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, it's an honor and a privilege to stand before you today as Executive Director of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society and welcome you to this momentous occasion. Today we gather here at the splendid premises of the Jewish Federation of Northwest Indiana. I'm grateful to the generous support in providing this lovely video for Professor Tobias Brinkmann's insightful speech on Jewish migration patterns in Indiana. I want to take a moment to recognize and celebrate a significant milestone in our history. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. This journey has seen us document, preserve, share the state's great, rich tapestry of Jewish heritage. Over the past half century, our organization has been committed to commemorating the experiences, contributions, and struggles of Jewish communities throughout Indiana. And in that vein, we encourage you to join the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. So if you see on your desk, if you have any questions, please reach out to me at my email or give me a call. And I want to extend my most profound appreciation to Congressman Frank Mervyn for his support and recognition of our 50th anniversary of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. By commemorating this milestone in the United States Congressional Record, Congressman Mervyn has shown his dedication to promoting the understanding and appreciation of our state's diverse history. This recognition not only honors our organization, but also acknowledges the invaluable contributions made by the Jewish community to the fabric of this nation. We also have the pleasure of hosting Professor Tobias Brinkmann, a distinguished scholar at the Malvin and Leah Frank and Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Penn State University, whose expertise in Jewish history has earned him international acclaim. Professor Brinkmann's research has shed light on various aspects of Jewish life, culture, and identity, enabling us to understand our shared history better. So I encourage you to read his book, Sundays at Sinai, a Jewish congregation in Chicago that discusses the life and times of Rabbi Bernhard Felsenthal, who started as a pulpit rabbi in Madison, Indiana. And we're truly privileged to have Professor Brinkmann with us today. And his presence exemplifies the collaborative spirit of scholarly inquiry in our community. And one last thing, a little bit of housekeeping in Zoom land. Please turn your mics off until the end of the lecture. You can ask questions in the Q&A. Those are encouraged, and we'll try to answer them by the end. And lastly, again, please consider becoming a member of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. It helps us bring programs like this to you that we're having today. And again, thank you to the Jewish Federation here in Northwest Indiana for all of your help and support here. And I want to give it off to Professor Brinkmann.
Yeah, you let me know if everybody on Zoom can actually hear me. So that's just a technical thing. We'll see. So maybe I'll just put this. Whatever, I can also hold it. So thank you so much for coming. I always enjoy doing these programs. Good, yeah, that gives me a little more room. I am not, so first of all, I actually have Indiana ties. I graduated from Indiana University back in 1992. So I had a Fulbright for a year. I'm originally from Germany. That's my accent. And I was an exchange student. And I picked Indiana University in part because they had a really good Jewish studies program. And I was interested in modern Jewish history. And the other reason was actually the proximity to Cincinnati, just like a bit like in the 19th century, because of the American Jewish archives that are located there. And at that point, I had sort of a vague idea. I was interested in German Jewish history, and I had figured out that pretty much all the topics were taken. But one topic was not taken, and that was the history of German-speaking Jews who went to America in the 19th century. And that's pretty much what I started doing. And when I was at Indiana, I remember I went to the AJS conference, Association for Jewish Studies, where I obviously go every year now, and met with Jonathan Sana and Michael Meyer. And they basically said, okay, forget about New York, it's too big, do Chicago. And so I ended up doing a book about Chicago. And that already takes me a little bit into this talk. I think that most people who work in modern Jewish history were obviously interested in modern Jewish history. So that's the history after Mendelssohn, right? So roughly after 1800, worked about Jews in cities, right? That's where most Jews moved and where many other people moved too. And it's easier to write a book about Jews in a city because you have everything in this place. It's in one archive or in a couple of archives. Writing a book about Jews in Indiana in small towns is really complicated because you have to go to all these different places. Some materials are in Cincinnati at the American Jewish Archives, but many items are still with, sometimes private individuals or, congregations, or they may be in some different state archives. That's quite a bit of work. And that's part of the reason why the history of Jews in smaller towns, also in mid-sized cities like Indianapolis, is not that well known, actually. And there's tremendous material. I think it's really worthwhile to work in this field. And the good news is that unlike in the 1990s, when I began working in this area, today a lot of this material is, you can do it from home. It's digitized. It's available and accessible. Ancestry.com is one way. They have digitized enormous amounts of census records. I'm going to show you one example in the talk in a few minutes. So it just requires patience and tenacity to connect stories. I noticed this part was important because unlike most people who work on Jews in cities, I became really interested in the migration after the migration. So in a sense, I realized that a lot of the people who I looked at in Chicago, I noticed looking at the census that their children who were born after they came to the United States you could sometimes see where they were born, which states, and that many of these children were born all over the place, so that people moved around a lot. And I realized also quite quickly that Indiana was one of the really important stopover places for Jews who ended up settling in Chicago eventually. And that made me a little curious. So I can't really give you a lot of detailed knowledge what exactly happened in places like LaPorte, which was one of these really important small town stopover destinations. But I can, from the material that I located in Chicago, I can really see that Indiana was quite important. And I think the same holds true for other states, for other cities. So, for places like New York, there are connections to Jews in Eastern Pennsylvania. And then, of course, looking at family histories, that basically takes you to the other side of the Atlantic where some of these migrants came from, and then connecting the dots where, family members went. It shows it's a very complicated story of networks that had a focus in Chicago, but also in places like California quite early on. And to make it even more complicated, I mentioned this, a lot of people were on the move. They moved around every other year. So I'll give you some examples in the talk. Okay. It's a little weird. So I want to start a little bit with the background. Actually, I want to bring this down a little bit. go. Okay. Oops, that doesn't show here. Yeah, maybe if you click this bar on the very top of the, just above the, well, the image here. No, no. Yeah, I show you. Here.
Oh, to do that.
We have more space for the presentation. So first of all, why does this all begin in the 1830s, 1840s, right? So in a sense, the modern Jewish history, in a nutshell, in a sense, is that in this period, 1830 or so, over 90% of all Jews lived in Eastern Europe, basically. So Eastern Europe, that's basically what's today Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Romania, broadly speaking. So that's where most Jews live. There were smaller communities in other places, but really small. Strangely enough, there were small communities that survived persecution and expulsion in the medieval period in the southern part of what's now Germany. Also in Alsace, which is part of France, and Bohemia. So there were smaller rural communities. But by and large, very few Jews around the Mediterranean. I don't want to go too much into the whole story, but in a sense, that is pretty much where most Jews were in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was very little developed, very rural. Everybody was poor. So I don't have to tell you the story. What changes in the 1830s is the beginning of industrialization, and that affected Central Europe and England, and also Ireland indirectly, much earlier than Eastern Europe. And industrialization meant technological progress, and it was not a good story for most people because it's the beginnings of a massive social and economic transformation. Around 1800, most Christians were basically subsistence farmers, and they all lost their jobs, basically. I mean, there were modern technologies, fertilizer, and so on. So already when there's land reforms, and people become free. So this is the story of Christians. They had a little plot of their own, but that couldn't feed a family. So they had to move to a city to get another job. So it's very complicated to explain this, but in a sense, there's a real economic transformation beginning, and more people were literally forced to move elsewhere because they couldn't live. Their jobs literally disappeared. And for Jews, Jews were affected by this also. Jews were in Central Europe and also in Eastern Europe basically banned from a lot of occupation. They couldn't really be farmers, they couldn't own land, a lot of occupations were closed to them. Most Jews in the southern region of Germany, and I'll talk about that quite a bit, something like 80% of all men were peddlers. And we are talking about a tiny population. There were sometimes 2 or 3 families in a village in South Germany. So this would be the region south of Frankfurt, north of Munich, east of Alsace, in this area. They were poor, and they basically, sold stuff to people. They went on the road, and they were all already in this time period part of networks, right? In a sense, if you sell, you begin to specialize in certain things like clothes. Others specialized in selling cattle. So there were a lot of and these people were networked. They had contacts. They, in a sense, they knew markets. They had experience with risk. So in a sense, a lot of these peddlers were essentially mini entrepreneurs. Not because they wanted to, because that was the only option that was really available at this point. And with the changing economy, the situation for these peddlers also changed. Maybe you can ask me in the introduction about this. I recently was asked to write a short essay about the Lazarus Morgenthau. So this is the father of Henry Morgenthau Sr., who was a very prominent figure, American ambassador in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, very important figure in New York, where he became quite wealthy in real estate. His son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was the Secretary of the Treasury under FDR. And the story begins with Lazarus, who grew up they were so poor that Lazarus and his children were essentially given to different families because the parents couldn't feed their children. I mean, and then Lazarus was very successful. Actually, he started a factory, and this is all in South Germany. And then in the 1860s, he decided to move to New York, and he failed spectacularly. He could not, his business failed. And Henry Sr., or Heinrich, as he was initially known, he never talked to his father, after these years, because they really fell out. And he basically had to put himself to law school, became a lawyer, and the story begins. But in a sense, at the beginning was a story of failure. So that also is part of this. So what we have is going on, and this is where it becomes important, cities and also mobility revolution, railroads, and better ship connections across the Atlantic. Most German speakers and Irish who came to America in the period, 1830s, 40s, 50s, came on sailing vessels, which was not fun, took 6 to 7 weeks. If you're interested in the American Jewish Archive, it's actually the diary of Bernhard Felsenthal, who I will talk about. He wrote a diary during the Atlantic crossing, and it's really hard to read. It's in German, so it's hard to read. It's easy to read, actually. It's very, but it's harrowing. I mean, he thought he was going to die. He got really so sick that people gave him basically up for dead, and then he finally, reached America, and he never went back to Europe for obvious reasons. But after 1870, most people who came across the Atlantic came on steamships. And that's a dramatic change. Steamships were faster, they were safer, and they made the crossing, in a couple of days, well, initially in about 2 weeks, and then by the turn of the century, about a week or so. So there are real changes going on. And so with better transportation technology, markets were shrinking, in a sense, or markets were expanding, and the experience of time and space were actually shrinking in a way. So that meant that products, information, services, that all became relevant in very distant corners of the world once the railroad reached these places. Eastern Europe is connected to the railroad much later than Central Europe in the 1860s and 1870s. And that partly explains why people began to move, because they had to move for the same reason. They lost their jobs, their economic opportunities disappeared, and the only choice they had was to move, essentially, if they wanted to feed their children and have a halfway decent life. So what happens is that people begin to move in very large numbers in the 19th century, not just in Europe and not just across the Atlantic, but also in other parts of the world. So this is not just the story of Jews, this is a story of many other Europeans, and other groups were much more mobile in some ways even than Jews. So if you look at the numbers for Norway and Ireland, they're just stunning in a sense. I mean, almost half of the population from Norway went to the United States. So that's really, Norway is a small country, but if you look at just the population numbers after 1880, when the Norwegian migration really began, Norway was very poor. Everybody who's been there, today Norway is rich, but that was before oil. Before oil, living in Norway was really tough. So moving to a place like Minnesota, Illinois, or Wisconsin really made a lot of sense once you could do that. And that also applies to many people in Ireland, obviously. And but there were also people from the South Asia and South China on the move, across the Pacific or across the Indian Ocean. So this is a global story of steamship lines and railroads, and also a globalizing economy. So there's a bigger story behind this. So when we come to Indiana, it is all about Chicago. So I started working on Chicago, and I noticed that a lot of the Jewish migrants who eventually settled in Chicago came to Indiana and stopped over in Indiana. And Chicago's story, I don't have to really tell you a lot about it. I really recommend the book by William Cronon, Nature's Metropolis. So Chicago is a quintessentially new and American city that comes out of nowhere almost, with sort of the exploration, and it grew rapidly. And it's all about natural, processing natural resources. So taking stuff to Chicago, processing it, and sort of the whole industry and service sector around that. And that happened really in a spectacular fashion. It comes down to three of these things. One was obviously grain, timber, and meat. That these three items are really foundational. And on top of that comes, of course, sort of the meta market, the commodities trade. The Board of Trade is still in Chicago. It's a really incredible story, which was initially, all of this was funded by investors in Britain, mostly, some of the East Coast. And what is also really noteworthy about Chicago's rise is that unlike other, even other large cities in the Midwest, a very large number of Chicagoans were immigrants who came from abroad. So just one number, which I find just to give you a sense, in 1880, Chicago had 500,000 inhabitants. In 1890, 1 million. So in a decade, 500,000 people. And this is a little bit like photographs. In reality, many more people came through and came in and left and moved on or came back. It's a very complex story. In 1890, these 1 million Chicagoans, 80% were born in Europe or the children of immigrants from Europe. That's a number, even in the American context, that's unparalleled. So in New York, the number is way lower. It's like 50% or so. So it's really, gives you a sense of this dramatic growth. And the industrialization and mass migration were sort of mutually dependent processes. So the more, cheap immigrant labor, the bigger could your factory become. And the employers depend on it, and the migrants hope to get a better life. And the perspectives are very, very different, obviously. As an employer, you want to build your business and make it bigger. For the migrants, many migrants from Eastern Europe, this is my current project that I just completed about Jewish migration from Eastern Europe globally. They knew they were going to end up with a terrible job in a sweatshop. They were not ignorant. People wrote letters, but they wanted a better life for their children. This is really important. There was no future in Eastern Europe. This is really clear. If you look at the economic situation in the Russian Empire and Galicia, it was really awful. So in a sense, people willingly did a journey knowing that they would work under very difficult circumstances in cities like Chicago, New York, because they were convinced it would be better for their children, and it turned out to be largely true. And this is also the case, of course, for non-Jewish migrants, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, who went on the same ships and trains to America as Jews. So Chicago is the big driver here in the Midwest. And it is a city of opportunities, obviously. For the migrants who I will talk about today, this turned out to be really a spectacular success story. So these were, I mentioned this, peddlers. They had been part of networks in rural areas in South Germany, in what's now Western Poland, and Bohemia, living sort of on the margins, poor, everybody poor. And what they had done, obviously, what you did back there, you do over here. And peddling was really a universal experience for many Jewish migrants. And I already mentioned they were entrepreneurs in a way. So if you have a small peddling business, you have familiarity with fashion, with changing markets. You know about risk and failure. You have experienced failure. This is something, if you are an independent business person, and there were also women doing this in some cases, you have experience with that. Coming to a place like Chicago, it was ideal timing. And this actually also applies in German cities like Berlin or Frankfurt. This is the takeoff period of the industrialization. So when this really gets going, and there were enormous opportunities in new sectors. And this is actually a story that hasn't been written. We know quite a bit about Jews moving to cities like Chicago or New York, but we do not know much about the business history. And the businesses were, the stereotype is it's all about banking and so on. Yeah, some Jews were in banking and finance, but they were here in the United States and also in Germany. It was other sectors, the garment sector in particular. So ready-to-wear clothing, this is new. Before, when Jewish peddlers sold people used clothes, they had knowledge fixing used clothes and selling those because nobody could afford tailored clothes. I mean, hand-tailored clothes, that's really expensive. Only aristocrats could afford this. Now with industrialization, there are industrial ways of making ready-to-wear clothes, and having sort of certain sizes. And this is a sector that was almost completely dominated by Jewish migrants from the German states in the United States. And Chicago became the big center of the menswear industry. Some of the labels probably are familiar. Hartschaft and Marx is one of the most important ones. And I'll talk about Hartschaft and Marx a little bit in a few minutes. So there are two kinds of businesses. So menswear was basically made in giant factories. It's all about division of labor. So you have, I think, something like 80 steps in a sense to make a suit. And workers did just one part of that in a sense. And they were paid by the amount of, whatever they had to do by the hour in a sense, or how many parts they made by the end of the day. So it was a pretty, not an easy job. And the owners were Jewish immigrants from South Germany mostly, whose heads themselves started out as peddlers, and they began investing in these businesses, and they built these giant places. Chicago was one of the centers. The other was, interestingly enough, Rochester in upstate New York. The other business is women's wear, which is entirely different. Women's wear is much more driven by fashion, changes every year, and it's much more sort of, there's not these big stores or big inside shops, but hundreds of sweatshops in a sense. And women's wear was centered in New York. And women's wear was never a business that really was attractive for German Jews, but was really from the early days a field for Eastern European Jewish migrants. And if you just get a sense for people working there, every year a new fashion. So these sweatshops only existed for a couple of months. You're laid off, and you have to, it's all about context, connections. There are constantly recessions, so it's not easy for the workers in this environment. And so the opportunities changed. Before the Civil War, there were a lot of businesses that were really attractive. So I mentioned the garment sector. So these are people starting out with sort of small shops where they make suits and then becomes bigger. Processed meat. This becomes a huge business in Chicago, right? The stockyards. And a couple of players in the stockyards were Jewish immigrants. The most important was Nelson Morris, who came from the Black Forest. His father was a cattle dealer, and he built a giant stockyard business. And there were several other Jews who were in processed meat. Why is something we can maybe discuss in the after my talk. Then we have boots. We have pretty much everything that people wear were interesting opportunities. The Civil War is very important in this story because Chicago was in a really good location for this. When the war begins, there was a huge demand for relatively simple uniforms, boots, and also all sorts of food products to supply the Union Army. And this is a real boost for the Chicago economy. Chicago was conveniently distant from the fighting, unlike Cincinnati, which was much closer. And so early on, there's a focus on Chicago as sort of the big place where supplies are basically manufactured and transported by rail, of course, right? By this point, Chicago is emerging as the railroad hub of the nation. And the Civil War is sort of this turning point where Chicago emerges as the real economic hub of the interior of the United States. And the older river cities, St. Louis and Cincinnati, which had been very important, are sidelined in this process. After the Civil War, for Jewish migrants coming into the city, these opportunities vanished. The bigger economic niches had been occupied, and increasingly the opportunities meant working in a factory, getting a factory job, so a blue-collar job. So these opportunities for entrepreneurs to big, really successful businesses became much smaller. There are still niches, so I'll talk about Sears and Roebuck, so the mail order business, in a few minutes. But for a normal immigrant, starting a business and building it really into a giant business, this became increasingly harder. And so after the Civil War, we have increasingly a story of Jewish immigrants becoming working class in a sense. Right, I already talked about this, so let's move on. Okay, so a few words on Jewish history. So the first, my field is Jewish migration history, and I'm very, very interested in the context, not just in Jews, but also interested in the others. And there are essentially two different narratives. The narrative that's still very dominant, not among scholars, but certainly in popular memory, is that Jewish migration is a story of continuous flight and from persecution. And in part that is true. I mean, I'm not in no way denying that Jews face, there's a long history of expulsion and flight and persecution and discrimination. But the story of these Jewish migrants from the German states really doesn't fit that narrative. These were people looking for a better life. Yes, there was discrimination in the German states, but that was not really the reason why they left. That's pretty clear. I mean, I've looked at a lot of memoirs and texts, and there are still older books that will say, wait a moment, there were anti-Jewish riots in 1819, that's correct. And there was also a lot of anti-Jewish violence in the 1848-49 revolution, also correct. But again, this is not the real reason why young Jewish men and women left. And so, in my opinion, a lot of the story is about economic opportunities and also economic change. And that also applies, and this is a little more controversial, to the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. So the standard story is the pogroms were the real reason. It is sort of still something you find very often in popular accounts, but in reality, Jews leaving Eastern Europe, most Jews actually came from what's broadly speaking Lithuania, so the northern part of the Pale of Settlement, so that's Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, northeastern Poland. And there were not many pogroms in this area. Most pogroms took place in what's today Ukraine. And actually, this is also more complicated. Many Jews from Lithuania moved to Ukraine after the pogroms, which doesn't make any sense, right? But so this is really a more complex story. And I think this is important just for the background. Also, the story of Jewish emancipation. And again, it's important not to tell this in isolation. Jews were, I mentioned this, were banned from many occupations. They did not have civil rights until the early 19th century, and actually not really until the middle of the 19th century. But it's, again, important to keep in mind, most other people didn't have full civil rights either. So many Christians were, sort of had to work for landlords, they didn't own their land, it was not a good situation. But the process of giving Jews civil rights works differently in different countries in Europe. In France, it happens pretty much with the French Revolution, with some back and forth, but by and large, most Jews living in France became full citizens of France with the French Revolution, so in 1791. There was some debate about this, it's not so nice, but they become French citizens. And that is the men, right, not women. So women didn't have the right to vote, men had the right to vote. So it's important. In the United States, which is my favorite example when I talk to students, Jewish emancipation is a non-issue. It just didn't take place. Jews were white, and so if you look at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, there's no word about Jews in there. In a sense, Jews became free citizens of the United States of America, that is Jewish males, not women, with the American Revolution. This is also interesting because if you're a Jew who's not emancipated living in Central Europe, you literally emancipate yourself by coming to the United States. So you free yourself in a sense and have a path towards citizenship. So this is quite an interesting point. And there were Jewish migrants who were quite aware of that, especially from Eastern Europe later. I've recently come across some for my book, I've mentioned this in there, where Jewish migrants were interviewed in Germany during the transit journey around 1900. And they're actually making this point, and the reporter is actually saying, America is an interesting place. A Jew could eventually become a president of this country, right? Because Jews are equal citizens, although there is discrimination. But so it's important to keep in mind that Jews in the United States were fully, full citizens. And Jewish immigrants coming to this country were on that pathway. The German states are complicated. In Germany, Jewish emancipation is a process that goes on for almost a century, from Mendelssohn, who first is sort of proposing it with some of the people in his social circle. All Jews in what becomes Germany in 1871 are only fully emancipated at that point, around 1870. And so most of the migrants that are featuring here in this talk literally emancipated themselves. So that is something I think that is important to point this out. But again, there's also a more traditional view that Jews were fleeing Europe because of that's not really the case. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. Many of the Jews who came through Indiana and Chicago came actually from the area that was west of the Rhine. So that was actually under French control until 1815. They were already de facto fully emancipated. So this is very complicated to explain this. So in their case, this didn't actually apply. Right, important is the context. We're talking here about a very small group. Before 1880, I belong, Jonathan Sana and others think it's more like 200,000. I think it's more like 100,000, relatively small number of Jews who moved from the German states and Central Europe to the United States before 1880. And they are a tiny, tiny part of a migration of millions of German speakers in this time period. And of course, Irish who come to these cities like Chicago and New York. So I talked about this, the time of the arrival is really important. Many came right at the time when America was sort of opening up. It becomes a very attractive place for, for small entrepreneurs. They are not on their own. First of all, these people had agency, they had information. They didn't just go, they really planned their migration. And I'll talk more about this. And they were part of networks, and I'll explain what that means. And Indiana is actually part of a strategy of Jews sort of planning to eventually settle in Chicago. And not just, people who belong to networks of friends, families, who had known each other for generations, essentially. It had been connected through marriage. Okay, this is, no worries, it's a very complicated map. This is Europe in 1812. I just wanted to illustrate here, what matters is what's not colored. It's this area on the left, on the west. It's important to keep in mind, France had actually annexed everything west of the Rhine. And this is an area where there actually is a significant Jewish population in Alsace and also in areas that became part of the German states after 1815. And the good thing for Jews was that there was a peace conference in Vienna in 1815. And basically the agreement was, it's complicated to explain it, but that the rights that Jews had acquired in these territories, essentially full citizenship, would not be messed around with, so they would keep them. So the only right they didn't have was to become a civil servant. This is going to affect Bernhard Felsenthal, who is from this area. So he couldn't become a civil servant in Bavaria, but otherwise they could own land. They had pretty much all the rights that citizens had, except political rights. So that's important. So they're not fleeing, they're not leaving because they're not emancipated. This is really important. Oops. Okay, so when I started, so actually my project began near Wrigley Field at a Jewish cemetery. The first problem that I had is, doing this really thoroughly, I had to know whether the people I was looking at in the census were actually Jewish or not. And names are not a good, are not reliable. So yes, there are certain names that are widespread among Jews, but you almost always have somebody who has this name who's not Jewish. Felsenthal is not an unusual name in Germany, and many people who have that name are not Jewish. So, so the only way to know if somebody's Jewish is a cemetery, and fortunately, there's actually a pretty old cemetery in Chicago. It's only about 2-3 blocks north of Wrigley Field on Clark. And it has actually a pretty crazy history in the last few years. But in any event, there are a number of prominent figures buried there. One is Colonel Spiegel. This is one of these migrants from the Palatinate, and who's connected to the famous Spiegel family. He was a colonel in the Civil War. He's actually buried there. So if you have the time, I would strongly encourage you after a Cubs game or so, or before a Cubs game, to visit the cemetery. It's really quite interesting. And so I was also lucky. Chicago Jews were pretty good in writing about their history. So there are a couple of histories that were written about around 100 years ago, a little earlier. And so I had a lot of birthplaces and villages. So all I had to do was put these villages on a map, and I end up with an area sort of south of Frankfurt, west of the city of Worms on the Rhine. Lots of small villages. When you fly out of Frankfurt, you often fly over this area. There are vineyards, kind of a nice area. It's very close to the Rhine. And the families who are from these villages are the Grünebaums, the Formans, Rubels, Felsenthal, already mentioned, Hart, Schaffner. I actually forgot Marx, he's also from this area. Spiegel, Strauss, Gatzert, Meyer, and Adler. So Gatzert is kind of interesting. Just recently I got an email. So Gatzert was a prominent figure in Chicago, a businessman. His brother was a mayor of Seattle. I didn't know this, in the 1880s or so. So quite interesting. And Adler is a very prominent figure. This is Samuel Adler, who was the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New York. And his son, Felix Adler, was the founder of the African Cultural Society, very important figure, also in American intellectual history. They're all from these villages just west of the Rhine. They're all connected through marriage. And I was interested in them because I wrote a book about the large Reform congregation in Chicago, Temple Sinai. And essentially these are the founders of Sinai congregation. So Sinai congregation actually is a Landsmannschaft congregation. So Jews from the German states were not different from Jews from Eastern Europe. They knew each other, they were a migration network. And in 1861, you could sort of come up with complicated explanations about religion, why they split from an existing congregation. But I think a big factor wasn't just Reform versus Orthodoxy or modest Reform versus radical Reform. There's also another factor at play, which is Landsmannschaft. And I think this is important. And let's move further here. Right, so this is what this looks like on a map. This looks a little abstract. The line that runs through this map from the lower left there in the corner to the upper corner on the left, that's the Rhine. And the dot there on the top is Frankfurt. And all these black dots are home villages of Jews who eventually settled in Chicago. And lots of these dots are clustered in an area just west of Mannheim and Worms. And just a footnote here, Worms has a long history of Jewish life, right? So some of these cities on the Rhine really go back to the Roman times in a way, and there's a history of Jewish settlement there. So there's a really ancient Jewish cemetery from the medieval period in Worms that survived. I mean, this is really quite an amazing story, actually. And the other two cities that were quite important are Speyer and Mainz. So these are cities with a lot of Jewish history, an important Jewish history, also intellectual and religious Jewish history in the medieval period. So this was interesting. I began to realize that these families marrying and having connections to each other, that this went back generations, right? This was not something that just happened because they met in Chicago or anything. There's a much more complicated story. And actually, I should say, I never really did the detailed research on the ground in Germany. So this is also something that still would have to be done. It's of course very complicated because you have to look up the history of these different places and archives and different archives. So I don't have the time to do it, but in a sense, I hope somebody might. But it's clear we have a migration network, and most people move in networks. Almost everybody moves in some sort of migration network. That applies to people who moved from Ireland, from Norway, whatever. So this is not a specifically Jewish story. And this is, begins with somebody going somewhere to look for a better opportunity, and then she or he pulls other people after them. This migration network, it begins in the 1830s, and I still had people coming to Chicago in the 1880s from these villages. And what I do know, fortunately, there are people now in these places who do research the Jewish history, because in many cases, the Jewish cemeteries survived the Nazi period. it's really interesting. The population really drops, right? I mean, many Jews move from these villages, and non-Jews as well, to cities or to America. But there was still a couple Jewish families left by the 1930s. And of course, then we have another emigration to America. And this is something I never really connected. If people still had these family connections that made it a little easier to escape the Nazi persecution because they had a relative, distant relative in America. But in some cases, that was the case. In the Sinai book, I do talk a little about this. The Sinai congregation was quite open-minded about providing, sort of a safe haven for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany because they were quite aware of their history. Okay, so I have a couple of stories here. So I noticed Indiana was important. The Foreman brothers. So officially, if you look at histories of Jews in Chicago, Gerhard Foreman was a very successful, well-to-do banker. He was born in the Palatinate in Dirmstadt, one of these villages there on the map, west of the Rhine. He came to Chicago in 1857. He died in 1897, very wealthy. And he shows up, not surprisingly, for the first time in the census in Chicago in 1860. So that could be it. I was curious. I mean, I noticed there was, I mentioned the birthplaces in the census. So there's an earlier history. You can't really see this. He does actually show up in the census for 1850 for Carroll County in Indiana. Eventually, they ended up in LaPorte, but at least in this period, there is his father, his mother, and various siblings, sisters and brothers, who are in Carroll County in 1850. And actually, what's also kind of interesting, there's an amount, one of his brothers, who was a little older, 30 years old at this point, so the census taker, or he told the census taker that he had $3,500. That's a good chunk of money at this time. So this is not bad. This is a pretty solid, he was a merchant, this is a solid business. This is not a peddler, but interestingly enough, while the older brother is a merchant, some of the other brothers are peddlers, and Gerhard was a clerk, which I also find interesting. So, so there's an Indiana story before the Chicago story. We already talked about Bernhard Felsenthal. So this is a little different story. Bernhard Felsenthal was not an entrepreneur or peddler business person. He was born very close to Dirmstein, Münchweiler, and he came to Chicago in 1858, only a year after Foreman. He died in 1908, and of course he shows up in the census in 1860. But as we know, of course, he left quite a bit of material, especially this diary, which is in Cincinnati. So he actually first moved to Lawrenceburg in Indiana in 1854, and then 2 years later to Madison as rabbi, and then he's sort of the Greenebaums in Chicago pull him to Chicago because they need a rabbi for this reform congregation that they're planning to found Sinai, and he becomes Sinai's first rabbi in 1861. So why did he leave? In his case, we actually know a lot because he wrote a lot about this. He went to university in Munich and he wanted to become a civil servant, but he couldn't, right? Because that was not possible in Bavaria. And he left, but he didn't leave alone. I think I didn't copy this. In the census, and actually the steamship, the record when he arrived in New York, after this really awful journey, which he documented in this diary, he came, I think, with a sister and another close relative. And another relative was already in the Ohio Valley, I think actually in Lawrenceburg or one of the nearby places. So I think in Louisville, and it sort of, there's connections. He didn't just go. What I also found interesting, since he wrote the diary, I mean, this is precious, right? When you have a diary of somebody writing about the actual journey, which I found a couple of these documents for my Eastern Europe migration book. So they walked about 20 miles to the closest train station in very southwest Germany. Then the train to Paris. They did sightseeing in Paris for a day, which I found interesting. And then they took the train to Le Havre. And Felsenthal basically said the first time he saw the ocean in his life, and he had a really bad feeling about this, and he was correct. It was not a good journey. And he never went back to Europe after this. So he also left essentially for economic reasons, because since he couldn't become a civil servant, He didn't have the right university training to become a rabbi. This is a little bit of a tricky issue. He actually didn't have the right studies. So there were people later saying he wasn't a real rabbi. He was ordained by David Einhorn by sort of remotely. And there's this connection to Samuel Adler as well, who came to the dedication of Sinai 1861 to Chicago. But he left because his only option was to work essentially as a religion teacher in these small rural communities. And his home community, everybody was leaving. So the only option he had was either move to a place like Frankfurt or to join family members who already were here in America. And it clearly sounded not so bad. And he took that decision to move to southern Indiana in the 1850s. This is a story that is only tangentially connected to Indiana, but it's a well-known story, and I just wanted to bring this up. So Samuel and Augusta Rosenwald, so these are the parents of Julius Rosenwald. They were both actually from the area where I come from in North Germany, Northwest Germany, actually. So Samuel left in 1854. He went to Baltimore. And he married into a already pretty well-to-do family, also from North Germany, the Hammerslow family. And then they were on the move a lot. And I think this is something that is not untypical for these migrants. Very high mobility. So essentially they're moving because they're moving to sort of branches of this Hammerslow business. The Hammerslow started a department store in Baltimore, and they had sort of interests in different places, and they sent Samuel, the son-in-law, essentially to run stores that were connected to this operation in Baltimore. So 1857, it's in Peoria. 3 years later in Talladega, Alabama. In the same year, they moved to Evansville, Indiana. In 1861, finally, they moved to Springfield, and this is where they remained. And Julius Rosenwald was born in the following year in Springfield, Illinois. The only unusual part of this migration is they came just a little later. I have migrants who came in the 1840s. Many went to California because of the gold rush, right? This is also just as an aside, going to California in like 1849, well, that wasn't so easy. There was no railroad at this point crossing the continent. So I don't know if anybody knows how you travel to California. It's quite a story, actually. And I tell you one thing, the Panama Canal didn't exist. On a ship all the way around, right? So this is not an easy journey. So this just as a side remark. It was, California was attractive. And I mentioned some members of the Greenebaum and Felsenthal family ended up in Northern California. So that's part of that. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the other side. So this is not my network, or only partly my network from the Palatinate. These were just a couple of places that I identified where Jews who eventually ended up in Chicago lived before they moved to Chicago. And you can really see there's a cluster in the vicinity of Chicago in Illinois, Indiana. Interestingly enough, not in Wisconsin, but in Iowa. I have a few, in the meantime, I discovered a few more in Minnesota. And I can only suspect that those who, the missing ones in Wisconsin were the ones who went to Milwaukee, and they sort of, that was a different strategy. But this clearly shows that, and this is only a relatively small sample, it shows that many migrants from the German states who came before the Civil War were highly mobile. And why do they move to these small places? Because they have no money. They're coming with little capital. They're peddlers. They realize they can't just go to a place like Chicago and rent a store. They don't have the money for that. So they need to accumulate capital, and they're part of networks. So they're coming with brothers and sisters. And in the case of the Foreman brothers, I think one of the brothers, if I remember this correctly, did go to Chicago right away. And then the others basically stopped over in Northern Indiana. And this is all about accumulating capital. And then when they have enough, make the move. And then they know the market. They know how Chicago works. They know which places are good which businesses are lucrative. In Foreman's case, he became a banker. Many others went into the clothing business. And again, I had the plan originally to write a history of Hartschafner and Marx, so a history of the ready-to-wear suit. Unfortunately, the sources were all destroyed. Hartschafner and Marx essentially went out of business. Only the label survives today, and the company records were all destroyed. It's really a sad story in the 70s. So I really found some corporate lawyers who were involved in this. And in one case, the files of an investment bank in Chicago were saved. The investment bank Becker is also part of this Palatinate network. And this was saved because one of the corporate lawyers was Jewish and realized this is important. But in many cases, unfortunately, these records don't survive. But in a sense, what this shows is that there's a real strategy here. And about coming into this place, making a little money, and then moving to a place for better opportunities. And this is only Chicago. I mean, there were Jews who moved to Cleveland, to Detroit, and they all stopped over in different places. What is interesting for my sample, there are a lot of small towns in Indiana. So LaPorte is of particular importance for some reason, because it's maybe in close proximity, the railroad that existed. Missing is Indianapolis. I think Indianapolis was not a stopover destination. It was a destination in its own right. In a sense, if you made it to a place like Indianapolis, you probably stayed there. You didn't have to move on to a place like Chicago. These are tiny towns at the time when these Jews stopped over there, right? They're much smaller than today, and they're still growing. And in a sense, in most of these towns, Jews opened small stores after they had been peddling, in a sense, and occupying the niche. It was like the main dry goods store in that place. Also noteworthy, I think, is New York is sort of clearly, I have not really drawn lines there, but it's important to keep in mind that the railroad didn't exist until 1848, at least for Chicago. So the really important corridor in New York, also for the railroad, if you took the train to Chicago when this was easier, like in the 1950s, 1960s, the train goes up to Albany and then west, right? And this is where there's also a canal which connects the Great Lakes with the Hudson River, and this is a big corridor for people moving west, right, in this period. This is a story that's not connected to Indiana, but it's connected to this, broadly speaking, to this region, which I find just fascinating. So Hermann Schaffner is one of the founders of Hartschafner and Marx, and he's a fascinating figure for a lot of reasons. Maybe you can ask me in the discussion. He was not born in Europe. He was born in the United States. His parents moved to Cleveland. I think they met there. They came from different parts of Europe. His father was part of that Palatinate migration network. It's connected to Chicago. And I think his mother was from another part, not connected. So I read in his biography, he was born in Reedsburg, Ohio. So I looked this place up. It's can probably not see the X. It's essentially right in the middle between Cleveland and Columbus. Even today, there are just like 3 buildings there. So I guess what happened was that both of the parents went on a peddling trip, and he came just a little early. I mean, this is the only explanation I have. There's no other explanation. And the birth was registered for this place. Even today, it's a township. It's not even a village. Look it up. I think that provides a little bit of an insight into how people, were they lived on the road, essentially. And he was born literally on the road. And he grew up in Cleveland, went to school there, and then initially worked, had a small business in, I think, Minneapolis, and then he comes to Chicago, joins his relatives from this network, and they start Hartschafner and Marx, which becomes one of the largest, actually the largest clothing business in the United States by 1920. Why is this man so fascinating? Schaffner he's one of the founders of the Kellogg School of Business, so he was very interested in business education very early. So the Kellogg School was founded the same year as Harvard Business School. So this is quite interesting. And Schaffner never went to university. He had very limited education. So I find that in itself interesting. And in 1910, there was a big, 1911, a huge clothing worker strike in Chicago. And Schaffner is the one who talks to the workers. As a result, he was ostracized among the other Jews in Chicago. So, but basically cut a deal with his workers. This is a really big moment in American labor history. And he did this because he felt it was the right thing to do. I think this has a lot to do with his rabbi at Sinai. But he's sort of, and it worked really well for the business too, because they didn't have strikes for decades and had very good labor relations. They had a labor arbitration panel essentially. So it's really a remarkable story in my opinion. But again, Schaffner was born on the road in the middle, somewhere in a rural place in the Midwest. Okay, so to sort of come here to the end, mobility and migration are really connected, obviously. So I think it's important in many books about Jewish migration and Irish migration, Polish migration in the American context, it's all about immigrants and they seemingly came straight to the place where they settled. That is not what happened. Many people moved around quite a bit. And I do admit that the mobility of these Jewish migrants from the Central Europe was unusually high. But I think it is really important to look at the migrations before and after the migration. Many people, this is quite interesting for my book on Eastern Europe, many Jews who came from Eastern Europe had already moved in Eastern Europe before they come to America. And many stopped over in Britain. Why? Because they didn't have the money. So Britain was a really good place to earn a little money in some factory in Leeds or Bradford in the north usually, before heading on to Liverpool and then go to the United States. I'm working with people with genealogists. I've come across people who went from Eastern Europe to America, they go to Britain, then they go back to America, and then they go to South Africa. So, the mobility even after 1880 was sometimes astounding, in part because it was possible. There were steamship lines, there were connections. If you had a certain reason, business reason, people were highly mobile. There's clearly a correlation between high social mobility and internal migration. So those migrants, those Jews in Chicago who moved around a lot, often were the ones who were really successful as business builders. That's quite clear. So quite a few of the really successful migrants had been in California in the late 40s, early 50s. Networks are absolutely crucial. And they are connected to business, they're connected to religion, history of congregations, and they're very much, they're part of that migration story. These networks had existed for generations before the migration, and they continue to exist, which I think is something, as I said, that needs more research, because I think there's still a transatlantic connection there. I do know that some of the people I talked about, some of these families connected to this network from near Worms, they would go back and visit relatives pretty regularly by the 1870s. My favorite example was Henry Greenebaum, who's a very prominent figure in Chicago. One year he said usually he would always go every year to Germany in the 1870s to the Wagner Festival. I mean, Richard Wagner was one of the most notorious anti-Semites in his period, but many Jews went to the Wagner Festival every year. And this one year he didn't go. Why? Because he dedicated the Jewish Orphans Asylum in Cleveland, right? Which is a big project for the May Brief. That is in 1878, I think. And that was more important than the Wagner Festival, fortunately. So networks are really an important part of the story. I already mentioned this, strategies are really important here. So people are clearly weighing the risks. They're looking for new opportunities. California is really only possible if you're on your own. If you already have children and a wife or a larger family, maybe an older relative, some of these migrants pulled their older relatives over. Henry Greenebaum, this is a wonderful story that I use in my book. His parents basically did really well, whether, in a sense, his father wrote that he had no reason to go to America. The reason why he went was that all of his sons, except one, had moved to the United States, and he and his wife wanted to be with their sons. That's why they came to Chicago. So that's it's. But if you're on your own, you can take risks and chase opportunities. this, I think, also explains, and this is my point, I come to the transportation infrastructure in a moment, why some Jews decided to stay in smaller towns, because the risks of building a business in a place like Chicago or making a longer move to a place like California, it's really risky. And there were people who failed. So having something that's pretty good in a place like, you know, Lawrenceburg or Madison, that could be good enough, and you stay. And so this is sort of the reason why not everybody moves to Chicago, because not everybody could be successful, and there were quite a few who failed. I didn't, again, you can ask me about this. I have quite a few stories of people who ended up, depending on support by other Jews because they lost everything, partly in the fire, but also because their businesses went bankrupt. I mean, this does happen. And Lazarus Morgenthau, so the ancestor of the famous Morgenthau family, is a good example for that. I already mentioned this. This is important. The transportation infrastructure is really changing in this period, right? So with the Civil War, we have the railroad really crossing the whole continent, the crossing of the Rocky Mountains, and that really means that markets become smaller, they integrate, they pull in people from ever further away. Some of you may know that the hardest part of the railroad, so the crossing of the Rocky Mountains, Chinese labor migrants played a very important role in that. So they come across the Pacific. For people in a sort of subjective perspective, time and space were sort of shrinking, right? Because you can cover enormous spaces in shorter time periods. Yep, that's it. So the story of these small towns in Indiana is really part of a story of a dramatic social economic transformation that changed everything in the state. I mean, that brought about this industrial area here in Northwest Indiana, brought about Indianapolis, you know, from a small town to a big city. And this Jewish migration is very much connected to that in a way. And these are migrants who come from the margins in Europe. They see opportunity, they find opportunity, and they're doing this in a really strategical way. And that explains also why many didn't stay in Indiana very long. They moved on to other places because it was a stopover place, but some stayed. And then this is also something that we don't know enough about. Quite a few Jews from Eastern Europe, not all of them moved to New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Quite a few then filled some of these niches that were left by some of the earlier Jewish migrants who moved to cities. And so we have another second story that may be the family story of some of you, of Jews from Eastern Europe who ended up in these smaller towns running stores, and their descendants often left after the Second World War, right? That's another big internal migration wave to the suburbs, to Florida and Southern California, of course. That also certainly affected Indiana. Okay, so that's my talk, and I look forward to questions. Maybe we have to do it with the mic. I think that's important for the, so I learned this for the Zoom people on Zoom. Sorry.
The town of Oberschwart in Bavaria, is that part of your pattern? Because Lazar Silverman, who was the Chicago banker, was from there. So is that part of the?
I know. So maybe I have to take the mic. Yeah. Oberschwart. Yeah. So the first thing, actually, I'm just going back to this map here. It's a little abstract, or maybe this map is a little better. So everybody roughly today knows where Bavaria is, right? It's sort of this big German state. Munich is the capital. Back in this period, after the Napoleonic Wars, a big area west of the Rhine was part of Bavaria. And so I think Lazarus Silverman actually is from the core Bavaria, not from the Palatinate. I think so. This is a different story. And I should say Bavaria is not a good place from a Jewish perspective in this period. So the Palatinate fell under the old French rule. Even they still had the French civil code, like the legal system and so on. But the core Bavaria, they was run by a government that was, if not anti-Semitic, very anti-Jewish. They essentially restricted Jewish settlement, and they also fixed the number of Jews living in certain places in 1812. So essentially, every younger Jew born after, like the 18 teens couldn't stay in Bavaria. They had to leave because they fixed the number, and they only changed it in 1850. So many Jews leaving Bavaria didn't have much attachment to that place because they were forced to leave essentially. So, but that did not apply in these areas west of the Rhine. So that's a very different story, even though they also belong to Bavaria.
There was a Chicago banker that
Yeah.
wrote the Sherman Act.
Correct, Lazarus Silverman. So he invested in mining, as far as I remember this correctly, in the Upper Peninsula.
Real estate.
Real estate, and
Actually, he owned the trolley car company here in Hamm.
Interesting. So I do know that he invested in the Mesaba range, that's the Upper Peninsula, in mining. And if I remember this correctly, he actually went bankrupt in 1893. So this was a very prominent member of the community. He was, I think, member of KAM, the moderate reform congregation. And so, these bankruptcies, that was disastrous. I had one of the founders of the community who lost absolutely everything. I mean, he's destitute and relying on support by others. And I have, text where he writes about that. And I find that, it's kind of sad to read it, but in a way there was also a support system in place, which is, of course, a long tradition in Jewish life, of course, supporting others.
Hi.
So maybe you ask a question last summer.
Okay,
It's probably
all
easier.
right.
Yeah, sorry. It's,
So I was just going to bring something up, which your talk brought to my mind. My father-in-law was born in Germany in 1900. He migrated to the United States in 1918. And of course, they didn't talk about a lot, so I don't know a lot. But his sister had married into a family here and came across and ended up in the meat business. And they settled in Hyde Park. Okay, Hyde Park is where Sinai is. And my husband and I were married in Sinai. And so it brought back all these memories of things that we didn't know about.
yeah. So she mentioned her story, right? So your grandfather, right, came from.
My father-in-law.
Father-in-law came from Germany in 1918. Of course, as a historian, 1918 is interesting, right? It's the end of the First World War. And he was just young enough not to be drafted, right? So 18 is the age. And of course, after Germany lost the war, and so it's not a good place. You want to leave, and if you have family here in the United States, it's an obvious place to go. In Germans, it's of course a tragic story that is part of my current project. I mentioned this book about Jews in Eastern Europe. This is a real tragedy, right? The United States passed a very restrictive immigration law in 1921, the National Origins Quota Act. That was really, I've really gone into the debates in the Senate. They wanted to, they specifically, this was proposed by a senator from South Dakota, specifically exclude what they call the Jewish race. And then the co-sponsor of the bill, David Reed, the senator for Pennsylvania, said, well, how should our consular officials determine if somebody belongs to the Jewish race or not? So they can't, which also shows that race is a, is a construct, it's not real. There are no human races, there's only one race, right, as far as I know. So this act was implicitly designed to exclude Jews from Eastern Europe. And the greatest irony of it was that it really benefited Germany. So in a sense, the idea was that Germans, Swedes, Norwegians, and people from the British Isles, grudgingly, they had to include the Irish in there, were welcome, but Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, and of course, people from Africa and Asia were not welcome and were de facto completely excluded. And this is the great irony that Jews from Germany actually somewhat benefited from that when the Nazis came to power, but only belatedly. The US essentially closed down immigration. There's this executive order by Herbert Hoover in 1929, and it's only in 1939, the last year before the war really begins. And in 1939, Jews made up over 50% of the immigration, right? I mean, this is a shocking number, in my opinion, right? For a very, very small group, gives you a sense of the pressure to get out of Germany. And it was German and Austrian Jews, unfortunately, who benefited from this, but Eastern European Jews did not, right? Because they fell under these quotas. And I've come across quite a few sources where people didn't even apply for a US immigrant visa because they knew the Polish quota. There were only 5,000 spaces every year. It was hopeless, and so many Holocaust victims were refugees who already had been displaced after the First World War and the Russian Civil War, and they were excluded. They couldn't get to the United States. And this is a very depressing story in many ways.
A quick question about Isaac Mayer Wise.
Yeah.
Is he aware of these family dichotomies, of these family networks? Did he try to utilize that to use that to his advantage of pushing his own agenda of uniting the reform movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was whether Isaac Mayer Wise, so the famous Cincinnati rabbi, an editor of the American Israelite, was aware of these family ties that to certain places. I almost certainly he must have been. I mean, he himself is a part of that migration, right? He came to America in 1845, if I remember this correctly. And then he was first in Albany and then comes to Cincinnati. In Cincinnati was really booming in the 1850s, right? So Chicago is still a peripheral place. And there was a really sizable number of sizable Jewish community, which was really German speaking at this point. And in my book about Sinai, Isaac Mayer Wise is a little bit of a how should I put it? So the people at Sinai had a very complicated relationship with Isaac Mayer Wise. This is mostly about theology, but it's also about power. And Isaac Mayer Wise really had the idea to unite American Jews. And so there's a little bit this idea that he would be sort of the supreme rabbi. The model was Britain. There's a chief rabbi. And I think this is in a way a good project because Jews were really split into all these different social and origin groups, and he really realized it was important to bring Jews together. So that's a good thing. But he also, in some ways, he's very much a politician in my view. So he must have been very much aware of that. And it's very clear because what is really fascinating about Isaac Mayer Wise is that he was on the road almost all the time. He went and visited these small communities. And this is a fascinating part of the story of these small town communities. Isaac Mayer Wise would actually visit. He didn't just go to Chicago or Milwaukee. He did go to small towns in part to push this project so that he had these supporters. And he wrote about this. And this is, I think, an underused source. We have this book by Shari Rabin, Jews on the Frontier. She makes a little use of that. The problem, I'm a little arrogant saying this, of course, is that she doesn't use German language sources, which I think are really important in this time period, because many migrants, not just Jews, German was the language. In Cincinnati, German was widely spoken in the streets. And so I think it is important to look at German language sources, just as it is really crucial to look at Yiddish sources for the period after 1880. And you can't just ignore that. And that's a little bit a problem in the field because many scholars only look at English language sources. So it's really crucial to look at especially German language sources in this period. So yes, absolutely. I think it was very much aware. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's bring it back to Northwest Indiana. I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing lots of you who have history here in the region. How many of you have history in the region prior to the Second World War, prior to 1939 in the region? Quite a few of you. Do any of you want to share any of your stories? We were talking about small town settlement. Anybody want to say anything about? Yeah.
I don't know.
Come on, Nancy, come on up. No, I'm just trying to bring it back to our local community.
Yeah,
if I
yeah, yeah.
may. Because I think a lot of people came
Yeah.
specifically for that.
Hi, so, my family, my father's family came from Ukraine, Odessa, Zhytomyr, I think.
Zhytomyr, yeah.
Zhytomyr, that's where my father's family came from. My mother's family came from Shaganovitz, which is in Poland. And all of them came before World War II, immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution. They all escaped. I don't know how well planned it was. I do think there were networks. There were people here waiting for all of them when they came. They didn't, the two different families didn't come together, but they did come to people who had come
In
earlier.
Northwest Indiana.
Well, sort of.
Okay.
Okay, so my mother's family were peddlers. They were peddlers and they, her grandfather and I came first before his children came, and he was a bricklayer. So he wound up in the Northwest Indiana, Chicago area, and he would go back and forth to Poland, and he was a bricklayer, that's what he did. And I think the South Shore train was significant somehow because he would go back and forth across the Chicago to South Bend area. There must have been a lot of construction going on, and they would make bricks, and I don't know much more than that about it. His kids came later. He raised, he used that, he earned money. He brought 3 of his children over. There were 9, and the other 6 never came. So his wife and his youngest 6 children were left behind, and they perished in the Holocaust. But his 3 oldest children were here, and they became peddlers, and they married, and they traveled between Lincoln, Illinois, Chicago, and Hammond. And we did find my mother's, my grandmother's first, she was married twice. Her first husband, she was registered at the Crown Point Courthouse, because in the year that they were married, in that time period, you may have heard this before, Crown Point was the Las Vegas of the United States, where you could get a quickie marriage. You could go to Crown Point, Indiana, and get married in 24 hours. And people would come from all over the United States to do this. Rudolph Valentino was married there. And so it was world famous for that. And they were married. They got their marriage license there. I'm not really sure that they were married. And that part of my mom's family, they did create a business in Hammond, and I think it was ultimately built out of their peddling business. They were junk peddlers, and they would travel around and collect junk, and eventually had a junk business. So.
Yeah, I just want to say very briefly, so this is really important, right? I mentioned this immigration law. There's a short window, not right after the end of the First World War. And the war ends in like Central Europe, but it only really begins in Eastern Europe. Because you have the Russian Civil War, and there are wars between all these new states over borders. Poland was at war with the Soviet Union, Romania attacked Hungary, so it's a very, very chaotic situation. And the problem was that a lot of these armies, they went after Jews. So anti-Semitism is now really an issue, and whatever happened in Russia before the First World War is overshadowed by these pogroms after, in this period, 1918-19. So the low estimate is that something like 60,000 Jews perished in these pogroms. It may have been up to 300,000. So this is a very scary, dramatic, dangerous period. And in 1920, there's the migration resumes. In 1921, over about 100,000 Jews came to America. So that, and then Congress passes this very restrictive law, and it brings it down. It already declines to 50,000. And then 1924 comes another law that brings it down dramatically. And the only way, so there were only about 10,000 who came every year after 1924. And what was possible was to bring in family members. So that's the one way, but they're already included in this 10,000, right? It gives you sort of a sense. And so I often meet people who say, oh, my family, they came like in 1922. And I'm always saying, boy, you were lucky. They were lucky that they came in. And your story is sad, right? In a way, some of the children never came, and the wife didn't come. I mean, what's behind that, right? And And I recommend, there's a really good book about this by Daniel, it's called Daniel Mendelsohn is the author. He writes for the, he writes for like the New York Times Magazine and the New Yorker, and it's his family story. The book title is The Lost, and it's about his family, and there's like letters that were written in the late 30s by a relative in Ukraine, and wow. And he goes on to research that, and he goes there and he finds family relatives he never knew existed in Australia. It's a sad story, obviously. It's the part of the family that perished in the Holocaust. But so I think this is, really important. Yeah.
Trent?
You said you studied the Rosenwalds. Do we know that he met his wife in LaPorte? Do you know anything more about that family from New York?
So I don't really know that much. So the name has come back to me, Peter Ascoli, right? That's the grandson I knew, who wrote a biography of Julius that was published actually by Indiana University Press. So I really only know about the business history. So in a sense, he moved to New York, he started a small clothing business there, and then he comes back to Chicago, and then it's this famous story, he and his brother-in-law basically become partners because Sears left the partnership with Roebuck, and it goes from there, right? And it's incredible how like a mid-sized clothing entrepreneur sees this opportunity of the mail order business, right? Which is incredible story. So I don't know exactly the LaPorte connection, but what I do know is that, of course, he grew up in Springfield, and he remained very connected to that. I mean, the founding of the NAACP is very much connected to these. It's a race riot in Springfield in 1909, which was horrific. And Roosevelt was very touched by that. Many of you will know that he was good friends with Booker T. Washington in this period, in Washington's later years. And so what happened in Springfield was he connected with that, right? So I don't know about the LaPorte connection. I'm sorry.
Anybody else want to share local stories?
I just want to say for time, if you do have a family story you'd like to share, a family immigration story, or any other Jewish story you'd like to share, please contact me on my card. I would love to do a whole history with you. So feel free to email me. It's very important to preserve those histories. Just basically because of time constraints. But I think, do we have time for one more question here?
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned the Foreman Brothers in Chicago. There was a store in Gary, an upscale men's store called Foreman Brothers. Were they connected?
I don't know, but I would think there's it's quite likely.
I think it closed after the big strike in Gary at the mills.
Interesting. Yeah, almost. I mean, in a way, you saw there were already. This is the census for 1850 that I showed. There were something like 6 siblings. So you can imagine. And I never found the other ones. I didn't really look that closely, but I know that some of the brothers went to Chicago, but I don't know what happened afterwards. So it's quite likely. And I do know, I looked at Hartschaffner and Marx. They had stores all over the nation. It's fascinating. I mean, people actually collect these beautiful, beautiful style books that they published. Beautiful. They were designed by, not by Edward Hopper, but by people like him. So commercial artists who then beautiful. And it's really interesting. I found quite a few for Indiana there at the Smithsonian, at the Museum for American National History. And it always has the imprint of the store that had that style book, and that was somehow saved. So that's yet another fascinating story that's connected more often to the Eastern European migration than the previous one. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming out. We appreciate the Indiana Historical Society coming out, and let's just wrap it up. Any more last minute?
I want to say
comments.
So I teach at Penn State, so we made an effort and there's a Pennsylvania Jewish Historical Society. It is really important to collect these stories. So we are now actually having students at Penn State do small research projects about their hometowns. These are often not Jewish students from tiny towns. And in Pennsylvania, the story it's a little earlier, but also the Jewish community is closed down a little earlier. So we now have, and they're often cemeteries, they're buildings One thing that we're doing is we're actually buying postcards on eBay because there were a lot of postcards around, like in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and they often show synagogues, stores, and whatnot. And this is one way to just document that history that is not so visible anymore today, or it becomes visible again when you realize that the big building on the high street in a place like, I don't know, Brookville, Pennsylvania, was actually a Jewish-owned clothing store. And so I think the work that Michael does is really important, and it's hard work. And these stories are really important because otherwise, they get lost, and if they're not recorded, so it's important.
Okay, thank you all for coming out. You can stay a bit and schmooze if you'd like. And thanks again. Thank you.